Black CEO denied access to his own boardroom. Minutes later, he fires the entire security detail. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to our main character. Ethan Cole arrived at the executive floor just after 9 a.m., the kind of morning where the city hummed softly and the glass towers reflected a clean blue sky. He moved without hurry, dressed in a charcoal blazer, crisp white shirt, no tie, nothing that announced power to strangers who believed power had a uniform. The boardroom sat behind a wall of frosted glass at the end of the corridor, a space designed for decisions measured in millions of dollars. Yet the hallway itself felt ordinary, almost quiet. As Ethan approached, two members of the security detail shifted their stance. One of them, Mark Reynolds, straightened his jacket and lifted a hand, palm open, the universal signal to stop. His voice was calm, rehearsed, and final. "You're not cleared to be in here today." Ethan paused, not startled, not offended, simply attentive, as if listening to a familiar note played again. He glanced past them at the muted silhouettes already gathering inside the boardroom. Figures moving around the long table, papers sliding, chairs adjusting. Mark asked for credentials that had never been required before, a badge that had never existed, a name on a list that had never been necessary. Ethan responded with patience, stating his name once, clearly, without emphasis. The air in the corridor tightened, not with noise, but with assumption. Mark's expression remained professional, but the tone sharpened, subtle as a blade hidden in fabric. "Policy is policy," he said, eyes flicking over Ethan's clothes, then back to the empty space beside him where an entourage was expected but absent. Time ticked forward, measured not by a clock, but by the way the hallway seemed to narrow, how the glass wall reflected Ethan's calm face back at him. Inside the room, no one looked out. No one opened the door. Silence settled into something heavier, something practiced. A junior assistant hovered near the threshold, then stepped back, choosing the safety of the room over the uncertainty of the hall. Mark shifted again and gestured toward the elevator bank, suggesting, politely, that Ethan wait elsewhere. The suggestion carried the weight of removal without the words. For a moment, memory brushed Ethan's thoughts, brief and uninvited. A younger version of himself standing in lobbies and offices where access had been questioned, where belonging had been measured by appearances rather than authority. The memory passed. Ethan remained where he was. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He took out his phone and made a call, his posture steady, his tone even, requesting a routine protocol to be initiated, nothing dramatic, just a process designed for moments when assumptions collided with reality. Mark watched, uncertain now, as if sensing the floor beneath him shift by inches. The corridor stayed quiet. The glass wall stayed closed. And in that stillness, Ethan waited, not for permission, but for the system to catch up to the truth it had just tried to deny. Ethan Cole stood exactly where he had been stopped, the corridor still quiet, the elevator doors opening and closing at measured intervals behind him. The call he had placed ended without ceremony, no dramatic pause, just a small nod as the screen went dark. To anyone watching, it would have looked like nothing had changed, but the temperature of the hallway had shifted in a way that could not be explained. Mark Reynolds cleared his throat and adjusted his stance, his confidence no longer as firm as it had been minutes earlier. He asked again for verification, this time phrasing it as a courtesy, as if repetition might soften the moment that had already passed. Ethan answered the same way he had before, evenly, stating his name and nothing more. He did not reach for a wallet. He did not pull out documents. He simply waited, hands relaxed at his sides, eyes steady. Behind the frosted glass, movement slowed. A chair scraped softly. Someone inside glanced toward the door and then looked away, choosing to remain seated. The boardroom had been designed to feel insulated from uncertainty, but uncertainty was pressing against its walls now, quiet and persistent. Mark took a step back and spoke into his radio, his voice lowered, careful, as if he were suddenly aware of how sound carried in confined spaces. The reply came quickly, too quickly, and Mark's expression tightened. He glanced at Ethan again, this time with something closer to calculation than dismissal. A junior staff member approached the door from inside, hesitated, and then stopped, eyes fixed on the floor, waiting for instruction that did not come. Time stretched. Seconds felt longer when no one was willing to be the first to move. Ethan remembered other moments like this, standing in spaces where access had been questioned, where silence had been used as a test of endurance. Those moments had shaped him, not by hardening him, but by teaching him when to speak and when to let systems expose themselves. Mark's radio crackled again, and this time the words carried enough urgency that Ethan could see the effect before hearing them. Shoulders stiffened. A glance was exchanged between the two guards. One of them shifted his weight as if reconsidering the authority he had been certain of earlier. Mark stepped aside slightly, not enough to clear the path, but enough to signal doubt. He asked Ethan to wait just a moment longer, his tone now almost respectful, the edges of command sanded down by uncertainty. Ethan nodded once, not in agreement, but acknowledgement. He had not come to argue his way through a door. He had come to see how far assumptions would go when left unchecked. Inside the boardroom, a notification buzzed across tablets and phones almost simultaneously. Heads lifted, brows furrowed. A quiet ripple moved around the table as names and alerts appeared on screens, information aligning itself faster than anyone had anticipated. Someone finally stood and walked toward the door, stopping just short of opening it, as if aware that whatever happened next would change more than a schedule. In the corridor, Mark's radio fell silent. He lowered it slowly, eyes fixed on Ethan now with a recognition that arrived too late to undo the moment. Ethan remained composed, his posture unchanged, the calm of someone who knew exactly where this hallway led and what waited on the other side. The boardroom door stayed closed, but the balance of power had already shifted, invisible yet unmistakable, like a current running beneath a still surface, preparing to rise. Ethan remained in the corridor as the minutes folded into one another, the quiet now charged with an awareness that could not be undone. Mark Reynolds stood a few feet away, no longer blocking the path outright, but not fully clearing it either, caught in the uncomfortable middle where authority begins to question itself. His earlier certainty had thinned, replaced by careful glances toward the boardroom door and then back to Ethan, as if searching for permission that no longer belonged to him. The other guard shifted his feet, adjusting his earpiece, listening to messages that arrived too fast and contradicted what he thought he knew. Inside the frosted glass, the silhouettes of board members had changed position again. A few now stood instead of sitting. One leaned toward another, speaking in low tones, eyes darting toward the hallway. Whatever alert had reached their devices had done its work, not loudly, not publicly, but with the quiet efficiency of a system correcting itself. Mark tried to regain control by filling the silence. He explained procedures, cited internal reviews, mentioned heightened security concerns, words that sounded practiced but now landed without weight. Ethan listened without interruption, his expression neutral, his posture relaxed, the kind of stillness that comes from knowing the end of a story before it finishes being told. He did not argue policy. He did not challenge authority directly. He allowed the words to pass through the space between them and settle where they belonged. A soft chime echoed from inside the boardroom as another notification arrived. This time, the reaction was immediate. A tablet was set down too quickly. A chair was pushed back with more force than intended. Someone reached for the door handle and then hesitated, fingers hovering just short of contact. Mark's radio vibrated again. He looked down at it, then up at Ethan, his jaw tightening as recognition began to take shape. The corridor felt smaller now, not because of walls, but because the assumptions that had filled it earlier were losing ground. Mark lowered his voice and asked Ethan, almost cautiously, if he would like some water while they sorted things out. It was a small gesture, but it revealed the shift more clearly than any apology could have. Ethan declined with a brief shake of his head. He was not there to be accommodated. He was there to be acknowledged. The junior assistant who had hovered earlier took a step forward again, then another, stopping beside the door as if drawn by a gravity she did not fully understand. She glanced at Ethan, then at Mark, then back at the door, her uncertainty written plainly on her face. She had been taught where authority sat, but not how quickly it could move. Mark took a breath and finally stepped aside, not fully, but enough to indicate that resistance had given way to confusion. The boardroom door remained closed, yet the hallway no longer felt like a place of exclusion. It felt like a threshold. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, not toward the door, but deeper into his stance, grounding himself. He remembered moments earlier in his career when doors like this had closed without explanation, when he had been left outside with no recourse but patience. Those memories did not bring anger. They brought clarity. Mark's radio went silent again, and this time, no one rushed to fill the space. The power in the corridor had realigned, subtle but decisive, like a compass needle finally settling. Ethan did not move. He did not need to. The next step was no longer his to take. The system had already begun to speak for him. Ethan remained still as the corridor absorbed the shift that had already taken place, a change subtle enough to be missed by anyone who had not learned how to read rooms built on hierarchy. Mark Reynolds no longer stood like a barrier, but like a question that had lost its answer, his shoulders slightly lowered, his eyes no longer fixed with certainty, but flickering toward the boardroom door as if it might speak on his behalf. Inside the frosted glass, the meeting had stalled. Papers lay untouched. Conversations had faded into low murmurs that never quite formed words. It was in that suspended moment that the junior board assistant, Daniel Brooks, stepped fully into the hallway. He was young, dressed carefully, badge clipped straight, the kind of employee who had learned early that survival meant blending in. He stopped a few feet from Ethan, hesitated, then looked directly at Mark. Daniel's voice was quiet, but clear as he said that the system update had just refreshed, and the access log now showed Ethan Cole listed as primary executive with full clearance. The words landed softly but carried weight, the kind that changes posture and rearranges power without raising volume. Mark stiffened, then forced a short nod. As if acknowledging information he should have known already. Daniel continued, explaining that the alert had been triggered by an internal verification protocol and that it had gone out to every board member present. He did not sound proud or nervous. He sounded factual, which made it impossible to dismiss. Ethan did not react. He did not turn toward Daniel or Mark. He allowed the confirmation to exist in the open air, unclaimed, undeniable. Inside the boardroom, movement resumed, sharper now, less controlled. One of the senior members stood and walked toward the door, stopping just short again, as if unsure which version of authority still applied. Mark cleared his throat and said Ethan's name for the first time, the tone different now, careful, measured. He suggested that there had been a misunderstanding, a procedural delay, language that attempted to smooth over a moment already etched into memory. Daniel shifted his weight, eyes down, but did not retreat. He had said what needed to be said, and the hallway felt different because of it. The other guard adjusted his stance again, this time stepping slightly behind Mark instead of beside him, a quiet acknowledgement of a realignment that required no announcement. Ethan finally moved, not toward the door, but slightly toward Daniel, offering a brief nod that carried more reassurance than gratitude. It was not about validation. It was about recognition of courage in a system that rewarded silence. The corridor no longer felt like a checkpoint. It felt like a threshold waiting for permission to open itself. Mark's radio vibrated once more, and this time he did not answer it immediately. He glanced at Ethan, then at Daniel, then at the door, understanding settling in pieces he could not reorder fast enough. Inside the room, someone reached for the handle again, this time without hesitation. The boardroom door unlocked with a soft click that echoed louder than any raised voice could have. Ethan did not rush forward. He allowed the door to open on its own terms, exposing the room and everyone inside to the truth they had briefly avoided. As the glass shifted, reflecting the hallway lights differently, it became clear that the moment was no longer about access. It was about who had assumed the right to deny it and who had quietly allowed that assumption to stand. Ethan stepped forward only when the space itself invited him, his calm unchanged, his presence steady, the corridor behind him now silent not with tension, but with understanding that something irreversible had just occurred. Ethan stepped fully into the boardroom as the door opened, not with triumph, but with a quiet inevitability that shifted the atmosphere more than any announcement could have. The room was large, measured in polished wood and glass. the long table reflecting faces that now looked up with a mixture of recognition and restraint. Chairs stopped moving. Conversations ended mid-thought. The space that moments earlier had felt sealed now felt exposed, as if the walls themselves were listening. Ethan took 2 steps inside and paused, allowing the door to close behind him, the soft click echoing with more meaning than it should have. Mark Reynolds remained just outside the threshold, visible through the glass, his reflection fractured across the surface, his authority now uncertain in a place that no longer recognized it. Inside the room, a senior board member cleared his throat and began to speak, choosing words carefully, framing the moment as a delay, an oversight, an unfortunate mix-up. Ethan listened without interruption, his gaze steady, his hands resting loosely at his sides. He did not sit. He did not correct them yet. He allowed the discomfort to settle, to reach every corner of the room where assumptions had gone unchallenged. A faint memory surfaced, uninvited but familiar, of standing in a corporate lobby years earlier, being told to wait while others passed freely, the explanation delivered with the same polite tone now filling this room. That memory did not bring anger. It brought clarity. Ethan finally spoke, his voice even, carrying easily across the table without effort. He did not recount the events in the hallway. He did not describe how it felt to be denied access. He simply stated that the security protocol had been activated for a reason and that the reason mattered. A few board members shifted in their seats. Tablets were unlocked again, screens lighting up with notifications that confirmed what had already become obvious. Ethan continued, explaining that the protocol existed to document moments when authority was exercised without accountability, when access was restricted based on assumption rather than verification. He spoke not as someone seeking apology, but as someone evaluating a system under review. The room listened differently now, not defensively, but attentively. Outside the glass, Mark's radio buzzed again, and this time he answered it, his posture rigid, his response brief. Inside, Ethan turned slightly toward the glass wall, acknowledging the presence beyond it without directly addressing it. He stated calmly that security was meant to protect the integrity of the organization, not redefine it, and that any team entrusted with that responsibility would be held to the highest standard without exception. The words were not harsh, but they were precise, and precision left no room for interpretation. One board member glanced toward another, then nodded slowly, understanding settling in real time. Ethan paused again, allowing the weight of his words to land fully. He had not raised his voice. He had not accused. He had simply drawn a line and clarified where it stood. The silence that followed was different from the earlier one in the hallway. This silence was not avoidance. It was acknowledgement. Ethan took a seat at the head of the table then, not as a declaration, but as a return to where he belonged. The chair did not scrape loudly. The movement was smooth, unremarkable, and yet it re-established order more effectively than any command could have. Outside, Mark lowered his radio and stared through the glass, realization now unmistakable. Inside, Ethan met the eyes of each board member in turn, his expression composed, his presence steady, as the meeting resumed with a clarity that could not be undone, the moment of denial now fully documented and already transforming into consequence. Ethan sat at the head of the table as the meeting resumed, the atmosphere now markedly different from moments earlier. The boardroom no longer felt like a place of control but of reckoning, where every decision carried the weight of recent events. He did not rush the agenda. Instead, he allowed the quiet to stretch just long enough for everyone present to understand that the pause itself was intentional. Ethan addressed the room with measured clarity, explaining that the protocol triggered in the hallway had already initiated a full internal review, one that documented not only actions but patterns. He spoke about systems, not individuals, about standards rather than blame, yet each word narrowed the margin for denial. A few board members nodded, others leaned forward, recognizing that the discussion had shifted from inconvenience to accountability. Ethan requested a real-time summary from operations and a screen at the far end of the room came to life, displaying timestamps, access logs, and recorded decision paths. The data told the story without emotion, tracing how authority had been exercised, questioned, and ultimately misapplied. Ethan watched the reactions carefully, not to judge, but to understand who was prepared to see the truth laid out plainly. Outside the glass wall, Mark Reynolds stood still, his presence now reduced to a figure waiting for outcomes he could no longer influence. Inside, Ethan explained that security was a reflection of leadership, and when leadership tolerated assumptions, those assumptions became policy by default. He reminded the board that trust in an organization was built not by image but by consistency, and that moments like the one earlier that morning tested whether values were performative or practiced. A board member asked if this review would disrupt operations. Ethan answered calmly that disruption was not the problem, unchecked behavior was. The distinction landed firmly. He then stated that interim measures would take effect immediately, not as punishment, but as protection of the company's integrity. Access roles would be reassigned temporarily, oversight would be centralized, and every member of the security detail involved would be placed under administrative review pending completion of the protocol. The language was precise, procedural, and unmistakable. There was no room for interpretation, only implementation. Ethan did not raise his voice. He did not seek agreement. He spoke as someone executing responsibility. A quiet acknowledgement moved around the table as board members understood that this was not a discussion to be postponed. The screen updated again, confirming that the measures had already been activated. Outside, Mark's phone buzzed, and his posture stiffened as he read the notification, the reality of consequence arriving without spectacle. Inside the room, Ethan closed the discussion by reaffirming that leadership was not about presence at the table, but about accountability beyond it. He emphasized that the company's future depended on its willingness to confront uncomfortable truths in real time, not after public scrutiny forced the issue. As he finished, the room held a steady silence, not heavy, not tense, but resolved. Ethan leaned back slightly, signaling that the meeting could proceed to its original agenda, the business of growth and strategy continuing within a framework that had just been reinforced. Outside the glass, Mark lowered his phone, understanding now that the system he believed he controlled had moved forward without him. Inside, Ethan met the eyes of the board once more, his expression calm, his authority unquestioned, the quiet certainty of leadership fully restored as the organization adjusted to a standard that could no longer be ignored. Ethan let the room settle after the measures were confirmed, the quiet now carrying a different weight, one shaped by understanding rather than uncertainty. He rose from his chair without urgency and moved a few steps along the table, not to dominate the space, but to remove any distance between himself and the people who had witnessed the morning unfold from behind glass. His voice, when he spoke again, was calm and unadorned, the tone of someone stating facts rather than defending a position. He said that what happened in the hallway was not an isolated mistake, but a mirror held up to how easily authority could drift when left unquestioned. He reminded them that the boardroom existed to challenge assumptions, not reinforce them, and that the responsibility began long before anyone took a seat at the table. He paused, then delivered the sentence that clarified everything with precision, stating that he had been denied access to the very room he founded, funded, and built to govern the company's future. The words did not echo because of volume, but because of truth, and several faces around the table tightened as the implication settled fully. He did not look toward the glass wall as he said it. He did not need to. Everyone understood exactly who the statement included and why it mattered. Ethan continued, explaining that he had chosen not to announce himself in the corridor because leadership should not require performance to be respected. He said that he wanted to see how the system behaved when it believed no one important was watching, and what it revealed had been clear. A board member began to speak, offering regret, but Ethan lifted a hand slightly, stopping the apology before it could take shape. He said that remorse was not the objective and that correction was already underway. What mattered now was whether the company would learn from the moment or explain it away. He looked at each person in turn, his expression steady, inviting accountability without accusation. Outside the glass, Mark Reynolds stood motionless, the realization now unmistakable. The notifications on his phone had spelled out the outcome, but hearing the truth acknowledged inside the room stripped away any remaining doubt. Inside, Ethan added that transparency was not a threat to leadership but its foundation, and that trust grew when standards were enforced consistently, regardless of who stood at the door. The boardroom listened with a focus that had not been present earlier, the shift undeniable. Ethan concluded by stating that the company would move forward with clarity, documenting the incident not to assign blame publicly, but to ensure that the same conditions could never be repeated quietly. He said that the lesson was simple and demanding at the same time, that belonging could not be determined by appearance and authority could not be assumed by position alone. As he finished, no one rushed to respond. The silence that followed was clean, resolved, and honest. Ethan returned to his seat, not to reclaim power, but because it had never left him. The boardroom felt aligned again, its purpose restored. Outside the glass, Mark lowered his head slightly, understanding that the reveal had not been dramatic because it did not need to be. It had been definitive. Inside, Ethan met the gaze of the board once more, his presence steady, his message clear, the truth now spoken aloud and fully owned by the room. Ethan remained seated as the board moved from acknowledgement to action, the shift happening without ceremony, as if the organization itself understood what was required next. A board member requested confirmation from Human Resources and Compliance, and within moments the screen updated again, showing that the interim measures had advanced to final decisions. The security detail assigned to the executive floor, including Mark Reynolds, had been formally removed from duty effective immediately, their access credentials revoked, their responsibilities reassigned to an external team pending restructuring. The language was clinical, precise, and irreversible. No one raised their voice. No one celebrated. The room absorbed the information with the gravity it deserved. Ethan watched carefully, noting who nodded, who exhaled, who looked down. Consequence did not arrive as spectacle. It arrived as clarity. Outside the glass wall, Mark's phone vibrated again, and this time his shoulders dropped as he read the message in full. There was no argument to make, no authority left to invoke. He looked once toward the boardroom, then lowered his gaze, understanding that the outcome had been decided without the need for confrontation. Inside, Ethan spoke. Again, not to announce the decision, but to frame its meaning. He stated that the removal was not about retaliation but responsibility, that leadership required the courage to act when systems revealed their weaknesses. He emphasized that every role within the company existed to serve its values, not override them, and that security, in particular, carried an obligation to protect people, not profiles. The board listened, aligned now, the earlier discomfort replaced by resolve. Ethan requested that the decision be documented fully and shared internally with context, not as a warning, but as a lesson in accountability. The request was approved immediately. The process moved with efficiency, a reflection of an organization correcting course rather than defending error. Outside, the external security team arrived quietly, their presence professional and unobtrusive, restoring order without drawing attention. Mark stepped aside as his replacement passed, the exchange wordless, the transition complete. Inside the boardroom, the meeting continued, but the tone had changed. Strategy discussions resumed with sharper focus, grounded by the reminder that culture was shaped in moments like the one that morning. Ethan did not linger on the outcome. He did not need to. The action spoke clearly enough. He leaned forward slightly and returned to the agenda, guiding the conversation with the same calm authority that had defined his leadership from the beginning. The board followed, engaged and attentive, aware that the standard had been reinforced in real time. As the meeting progressed, the glass wall no longer felt like a barrier but a boundary that had been properly respected. Outside, the corridor returned to its quiet rhythm, elevators opening and closing, staff moving through with renewed awareness. Mark walked away slowly, his role concluded, the weight of assumption replaced by the reality of consequence. Inside, Ethan concluded the meeting with efficiency, ensuring that next steps were clear and responsibilities assigned. There was no need for closing remarks about the incident. The company had already responded. As the board members gathered their materials and stood, several offered brief nods of acknowledgement to Ethan, gestures that carried understanding rather than apology. He returned them evenly, his expression composed. When the room finally emptied, Ethan remained for a moment, looking around the space he had built, governed, and protected. The boardroom was quiet again, but it was a different quiet now, one grounded in accountability. Ethan stood, straightened his jacket, and walked toward The path clear, the standard set, the system corrected not by force, but by leadership exercised exactly when it mattered most. Ethan walked out of the boardroom and into the corridor with the same measured pace he had maintained all morning, the difference now resting not in how he moved, but in how the space responded. The hallway no longer felt like a checkpoint or a test. It felt neutral, balanced, restored to its intended purpose. Employees who passed by offered brief nods, not out of obligation, but recognition. Ethan returned them with the same calm respect, understanding that moments like this reshaped culture quietly, without announcements. As he reached the elevator, he paused, not because he needed to wait, but because reflection had earned its place. He thought about how easily power could be mistaken for permission and how often silence was interpreted as absence. He knew the morning would be remembered by some as uncomfortable and by others as corrective, but for him it was neither dramatic nor surprising. It was necessary. The elevator doors opened, and Ethan stepped inside alone, the soft hum of descent mirroring the settling of the moment itself. By the time he reached the lobby, the building had returned to its steady rhythm, meetings rescheduled, emails sent, routines uninterrupted on the surface. Yet beneath that normalcy, something had shifted. Standards had been clarified. Expectations had been reinforced. The organization had been reminded that leadership was not defined by who guarded the door, but by who was accountable when the door was wrongly closed. Ethan exited the building and paused on the sidewalk, the city moving around him with familiar indifference. Cars passed. People walked by. The world did not stop for moments like this, and it did not need to. Change rarely announced itself. It embedded quietly and revealed its impact over time. Ethan adjusted his jacket and began walking toward his next meeting, aware that the story would likely be discussed in fragments and interpretations, but confident that the truth had already done its work. Inside the building, new protocols were already being implemented, conversations reframed, assumptions questioned. Outside, Ethan moved forward without looking back, carrying no resentment, no triumph, only clarity. He knew that dignity did not require defense when systems were willing to correct themselves. As he crossed the street, he recalled the principle that had guided him. Long before he ever sat at a boardroom table, that respect was not something to be demanded, but something to be expected and enforced through consistency. He had not raised his voice that morning. He had not revealed his title until it mattered. He had allowed the system to speak, and when it did, he responded with action, not emotion. The lesson would last longer than any confrontation could have. By the time Ethan reached his destination, the incident had already begun to fade into policy updates and internal notes, its significance carried forward quietly by those who understood what it represented. The boardroom would host many meetings after that day, decisions made, strategies debated, futures shaped, but the standard set that morning would remain, unseen but present, like a foundation beneath the table. Ethan stepped inside his next appointment with the same composure he always carried, not because the world had changed overnight, but because moments like the one he had just navigated were how change was built. Not through spectacle, not through noise, but through steady leadership that corrected course when it mattered most, leaving behind not an echo of conflict, but a clear path forward grounded in accountability, respect, and the quiet certainty that belonging should never be questioned at the door.